On the night of November 11, 1940, 21 biplanes from a Royal Navy aircraft carrier launched a surprise attack on the Italian fleet, anchored in the port of Taranto. The Italian ships were protected by anti-torpedo nets and surrounded by barrage balloons and anti-aircraft defenses. They thought they were immune to an air attack. However, in less than 2 hours, the Swordfish torpedo bombers struck 3 battleships and several cruisers and severely damaged the port installations. The Royal Navy gained effective control of the Mediterranean, losing just 2 aircraft and 4 crewmen. It was the first time carrier-borne aircraft had been used in an attack on heavily defended warships. The raid not only revolutionized naval warfare, it also changed the course of history. Other navies took a keen interest in the Royal Navy's use of an aircraft carrier to launch an attack at long range, particularly the Japanese Imperial Fleet. Just over a year later, the Japanese would use the aircraft carrier to launch an assault on the American fleet in Pearl Harbor. From the earliest days of aviation, navies began to look into the possibility of using seaplanes for observation and reconnaissance. In 1910, exactly 30 years before the raid on Taranto, the American aviator Eugene Ely demonstrated another way of using air power at sea by making the first flight from a warship. He flew a Curtiss biplane off a platform mounted over the bow of the battleship USS Birmingham. Ely's success led to further experimental flights by daring young officers in other navies. But before World War I, the commanders of the world's major fleets were not interested in developing air power at sea. For them, the mighty battleship remained the cornerstone of naval power. They believed that a clash between these leviathans would decide the outcome of the next naval war. Britain raced against Germany to build more dreadnoughts, the revolutionary all-big-gun battleships the Royal Navy introduced in 1906. Other navies followed suit. The Italians launched their first dreadnought, the Conte di Cavour, in 1911. But its arrival overshadowed an Italian achievement which would have much greater significance for the future. In the same year, Captain Guidoni dropped a torpedo from the air for the first time. When World War I began, Britain's Royal Navy changed its views on air power and moved swiftly to get aircraft to sea for reconnaissance. Ferries were converted to accommodate the planes. The Royal Navy also built a takeoff deck over the forward turrets of the battlecruiser HMS Furious. At first, seaplanes took off from this deck, but they still had to land on the sea and be winched back on board. They experimented by launching Sopwith-Pup fighters off the deck. These could attack enemy reconnaissance aircraft and airships, but they still could not land back on the ship. Once the fighter's mission was completed, the aircraft had to crash land into the sea. With luck, the pilot would survive the landing. Experiments continued, and in August 1917, Lieutenant Dunning made the first ever landing on a moving ship. He sideslipped onto the bow deck of HMS Furious and was hauled down by the crew. However, in a landing 5 days later, Dunning crashed over the side and drowned. To try to make landing safer, a second deck was built at the stern, but the superstructure remained an obstacle, and aircraft had to be maneuvered past it from the landing to the takeoff deck. The turbulence from the superstructure also made landing extremely dangerous. Of the first 13 attempts by pups equipped with skids, only 3 were successful. But despite the problems, the concept of deck landing had been proven. In July 1918, HMS Furious made history when it launched 7 Sopwith Camels on a bombing raid against the Zeppelin airship sheds at Tondern on Germany's North Sea coast. Two airships were destroyed during the raid. It confirmed that air attack from the sea was possible. Designers soon realized that the solution to the landing problem was to create a completely flush flight deck. The first carrier with a completely flat deck was built from a former liner and named HMS Argus. It could carry 18 fighter or attack aircraft. Argus joined the Royal Navy in September 1918 and proved an immense success. The Admiralty ordered 6 more ships, including the Furious, to be converted to flush-deck carriers. They were to be in service by 1919 for an ambitious raid on the German High Seas Fleet, sheltering in its home ports. But the war ended before this plan could be implemented. By the end of World War I, the Royal Navy had a commanding lead in naval aviation. Other navies were watching the British technological developments closely. The Japanese Navy introduced its first carrier in 1922, and 2 more large carriers by the end of the decade. The U.S. Navy introduced the USS Langley in 1922. It was capable of carrying 55 aircraft, a remarkable number at the time. Langley was followed by 2 more large carriers in the late 1920s. As more carriers were being built, U.S. Brigadier General Billy Mitchell began to show that naval air power could eclipse the mighty battleship in war. Mitchell organized several spectacular demonstrations using U.S. air power to sink obsolete battleships and German prize ships. But the many admirals in the U.S. Navy and others around the world were not convinced, and the battleship continued to be seen as the main naval weapon. General Mitchell was court-martialed for his outspoken views and demoted to the rank of colonel. After he left the Army, he continued to advocate that aircraft would revolutionize naval warfare. He even predicted that the Japanese would launch an air attack against the American fleet at Pearl Harbor at 7:30 on a Sunday morning. Mitchell's views about the coming supremacy of air power were mirrored by those of the Italian general Giulio Douhet. Based on Italy's development of heavy bombers during World War I, Douhet believed strategic bombing would win future wars. When Benito Mussolini assumed power in 1922, Douhet's concept of a substantial bombing force was given the green light. The Italian Air Force, the Regia Aeronautica, was given responsibility for all military aviation, including support of the Navy, and began receiving large numbers of modern aircraft, including the SM-79 Sparviero, or Sparrowhawk. The Sparviero was one of the fastest bombers of its day. It also served as a highly effective torpedo bomber against enemy shipping. There was a difference in the Italian approach. Since Italy's shoreline stretched far into the Mediterranean, they did not see the need to develop the idea of deploying air power from ships. The Regia Aeronautica was able to support the Italian Navy from land and over what they called Mare Nostrum, or Our Sea. The Navy concentrated on building large numbers of fast and graceful warships. Because of their speed, they could reach any point on the coastline of the Mediterranean Sea within 24 hours. By the late 1930s, the Regia Marina had 6 battleships and numerous heavy cruisers and other warships. It was now both larger and more modern than its main rival in the Mediterranean, the French fleet based at Toulon. From there, the French controlled the western Mediterranean, while the bases of her ally Britain at Gibraltar, Malta, and Alexandria dominated access to the Atlantic and the sea lanes to the Suez Canal and the Far East. But the Italian High Command was not worried by this. The Mediterranean was Mare Nostrum, in which their powerful fleet could be just as big a threat to Britain and France by remaining in its home ports as by aggressive patrolling of the high seas. However, this attitude also encouraged many Italian naval commanders to adopt a defensive mentality just as war was approaching. When World War II broke out in September 1939, there were only 4 British capital ships in the whole Mediterranean, too few to mount offensive operations. The Italians were safe, for now. The British were not too concerned, since most of the countries bordering the Mediterranean Sea were either allies, like France and Egypt, or neutral, like Spain and Italy. Several capital ships were sent back to home waters to defend Britain and its sea lanes. 2 carriers were kept in the Mediterranean to provide air cover for the shipping, which continued safely into 1940. It was the calm before the storm. At the outbreak of World War II, the Royal Navy possessed 7 aircraft carriers, more than any other country. But in other respects, its lead in naval aviation had declined. Since the First World War, all military aircraft had been placed under the control of the Royal Air Force, and for 20 years, support for the Navy had received little attention. In 1939, the Royal Navy took back control of carrier-borne aircraft, but had only 200 aircraft at sea. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps had 2,000 planes for maritime support. Furthermore, the American designs were far more advanced, with all-metal monoplanes acting specifically as dive or torpedo bombers. The main British torpedo bomber was the Fairey Swordfish biplane, which entered service in 1936. The fabric-covered Swordfish, known as the string bag, was considered antiquated by World War II, but it still proved lethally effective. Powered by a 750-horsepower Pegasus engine, it had a top speed of 150 miles per hour and a comfortable cruising speed of just over 100 miles per hour to a range of 500 miles when fully armed. For want of other aircraft types, the Swordfish had many roles, but was primarily a torpedo bomber carrying a 1,600-pound, 18-inch torpedo. Underwing racks carried up to 6 250-pound bombs and 8 flares. The biplane configuration of the Swordfish made it highly maneuverable and allowed a low approach speed, which was ideal for landing on the restricted area of a carrier flight deck. The naval war began badly for Britain. One carrier, HMS Courageous, was torpedoed within days of the outbreak. A second, HMS Glorious, was destroyed by the guns of the German pocket battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau during the Battle for Norway in 1940. The battleship still appeared to reign supreme at sea. In the following month, France was attacked, and in June sought an armistice with Germany. During the last days of the campaign, Mussolini declared war on France and Britain in the hope of gaining some easy pickings for the Italian Empire. There was now every likelihood that the French fleet would fall into German hands. Within a matter of weeks, the whole balance of power in the Mediterranean had tilted to the Axis partners. The British had to eliminate the French fleets at Toulon and Mirs el-Kabir in Algeria. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill took what he described as a hateful decision, the most unnatural and painful in which I have ever been involved. He demanded that the French fleet surrender or face destruction. On July 3, 1940, the Royal Navy's Force H, under the command of Vice Admiral Sir James Somerville, arrived off the port of Mirs el-Kabir. The French ignored his demands to surrender, so the British opened fire. Much of the French fleet, including 3 battleships, was sunk at its moorings. 1,250 Frenchmen died in the onslaught. Foolishly, the French announced that the modern battle cruiser Dunkirk had escaped destruction. So 2 days later, the carrier HMS Ark Royal returned, and her Swordfish aircraft swiftly completed the job. It was the first time that a capital warship had been disabled at its moorings inside a harbor by a torpedo bomber. The Royal Navy did not forget the significance of the sinking of the Dunkirk. The following day, July 7th, a British submarine spotted a powerful Italian naval force escorting a convoy to Libya in North Africa. The Commander-in-Chief of the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean, Admiral Sir Andrew Brown Cunningham, or ABC as he was better known, immediately set to sea in his flagship, HMS Warspite. With him were the venerable World War I battleships HMS Ramillies and HMS Malaya, as well as the aging aircraft carrier HMS Eagle. On July 9th, as the Italian fleet was returning to its home port of Taranto, it was intercepted off the coast of Calabria at Cape Spartivento. The British opened fire at long range, and HMS Warspite struck the Italian battleship Giulio Cesare from a distance of 26,000 yards in a display of remarkable gunnery. The Italian fleet turned and fled behind a smokescreen toward Taranto. The Royal Navy pursued it, but soon came within range of Italian land-based bombers which proceeded to bomb both fleets. The cruiser HMS Gloucester suffered a direct hit on the bridge, which caused many casualties, but overall the Italian air attacks were surprisingly ineffective. The Italian Navy complained bitterly about the Air Force's performance. 10 days later, the British gained another success when the Australian light cruiser HMAS Sydney sank the Italian cruiser Bartolomeo Colleone off the island of Crete. Mussolini's Mare Nostrum appeared to be little more than a boast, as the Royal Navy gained dominance across the Mediterranean despite the advanced age of most of the British ships and the fact that they were heavily outnumbered by the Italians. Rubbing salt into the wounds, the British garnered another spectacular success on August 22nd, when the Swordfish of 824 Squadron from HMS Eagle attacked Italian warships in Bamba Bay west of Tobruk, Libya. After refueling at a desert airstrip, 3 Swordfish took off from Sidi Barrani, led by Captain Ali Patch of the Royal Marines. They then unleashed their torpedoes at the 4 ships sheltering in Bamba Bay. Remarkably, all 4 ships, 2 submarines, a destroyer, and a supply ship were sunk with just 3 torpedoes. While the British were beginning to demonstrate the value of naval air power, the Royal Navy received 2 new carriers named HMS Illustrious and HMS Formidable. Weighing 23,000 tons, they had a top speed of 31 knots, and were the first carriers built with armored flight decks. They were well equipped to survive against air attacks, but they could only carry up to 36 aircraft. HMS Illustrious was sent immediately to join the Mediterranean fleet, along with the battleship HMS Valiant. Both vessels were equipped with modern radar systems. There they joined the aircraft carrier Eagle and 2 battleships, substantially reinforcing the British fleet in the Mediterranean. In response, the Italians reinforced the fleet at Taranto with the Regia Marina's most powerful capital ships, including the newest battleships Littorio and Vittorio Veneto. Now that he had 2 carriers in the eastern Mediterranean, Admiral Cunningham decided to mount an aerial attack on the Italian fleet lurking in Taranto harbor. He ordered a plan for Operation Judgment. As the planning for the raid on the Italian fleet at Taranto began, Admiral Cunningham drew on the past experiences of one of his carrier captains. During World War I, Lieutenant Commander Arthur Lumley St. George Leicester had served at Taranto flying seaplanes and had been decorated by the Italians for his war service. By 1938, he was captain of the aircraft carrier HMS Furious serving in the Mediterranean. As an exercise, his Swordfish pilots trained repeatedly for night raids on defended harbors like Taranto. Leicester returned to the Mediterranean in 1940 as the Rear Admiral in charge of carrier operations and flew his flag aboard HMS Illustrious. In September, Leicester presented his plan to Admiral Cunningham in Alexandria, Egypt. It called for the carrier group HMS Eagle and HMS Illustrious to rendezvous off the Greek island of Cephalonia. Their 30 Swordfish aircraft were to attack Taranto in 2 waves from 2 different directions, 1 hour apart. Leicester knew that Taranto harbor was divided into 2 sections, the outer Mar Grande, where the major warships were moored, and the inner Mar Piccolo, where smaller vessels were kept. The Italians were well prepared for any attack. Their first line of defense was a series of 13 gigantic listening devices that could detect an aircraft 30 miles away. Around the port were 90 barrage balloons, 21 batteries of heavy anti-aircraft guns, 84 automatic cannons, and over 100 heavy machine guns. There were also 22 searchlights to illuminate attacking aircraft and dazzle the pilots. In addition, every warship in the harbor was well equipped with anti-aircraft guns. The ships themselves were surrounded by over 4,000 yards of anti-torpedo nets, designed specifically to thwart aerial torpedo attacks. It seemed a futile task to attack this force with just 30 fabric-covered biplanes. Nonetheless, by mid-October, the Swordfish squadrons of HMS Eagle and HMS Illustrious had practiced and trained to a high level of expertise. Cunningham decided to mount the raid against Taranto on October 21st, Trafalgar Day, an auspicious day for the Royal Navy to wreak havoc and confusion upon the enemy. The Swordfish were modified with long-range fuel tanks fitted in the rear cockpit in place of one crewman. However, one caught fire during fitting aboard HMS Illustrious, and 2 Swordfish were destroyed. They then discovered that HMS Eagle had been seriously damaged by near misses in past battles and needed repair. Before departure, its 5 remaining Swordfish were transferred to the fire-damaged Illustrious. There were now only 24 Swordfish available, and HMS Illustrious would have to undertake the raid alone. Over the next 3 days, 3 Swordfish aircraft were lost during routine patrols. The battle-damaged HMS Eagle had contaminated the aviation fuel tanks with water, causing the aircraft to crash. There were only 21 Swordfish left. With so few aircraft, the raid seemed impossible now. The operation was postponed until November. Meanwhile, more reconnaissance flights were conducted over Taranto. 3 Martin, Maryland bombers provided intelligence. Their photographs were superior to anything taken previously and were analyzed by the Photo Intelligence Unit at Alexandria. They show that the battleships and heavy cruisers were still moored at the Mar Grande. The lighter cruisers and destroyers were aligned with their sterns to the quay of the Mar Piccolo. The pilots of HMS Illustrious studied the photographs carefully. Cunningham decided to attack the battleships in the Mar Grande with torpedoes, and the other ships in the Mar Piccolo with bombs. The Swordfish were armed with 18-inch torpedoes. The average depth of water in the Mar Grande was 50 feet, so they were set to run at a speed of 27 knots at a depth of 31 feet. This would allow them to pass under the anti-torpedo nets, which were known to extend to a depth of 24 feet. On November 11th, virtually every ship of the Royal Navy's Mediterranean Fleet was at sea, as well as several merchant convoys sent to confuse Italian naval intelligence. During the evening, HMS Illustrious, accompanied by 4 cruisers and 4 destroyers, arrived off the Greek island of Cephalonia, 170 miles southeast of Taranto. She turned into the wind. The 21 Swordfish were divided into 2 waves, with 12 aircraft in the first and 9 in the second. The first wave was led by Flight Commander Kenneth Hooch Williamson in Swordfish L-4A, with his observer Lieutenant Norman Blood Scarlett in the back. they took to the air at 20:35 hours. Operation Judgment was underway. It would be the first aerial raid from the sea against a fleet in a defended harbor. November 11, 1940, Operation Judgment was in motion. During the flight towards Taranto, one Swordfish became separated from the formation in some clouds. By chance, the aircraft piloted by Lieutenant Swain arrived almost 30 minutes before the other aircraft. It was soon detected by the Italian listening devices, and the defenders were ready for action. With the element of surprise lost, the remainder of the first wave were met with a ferocious barrage of fire. The Swordfish flare droppers then went ahead and released their ordnance behind the battleships, so that they were silhouetted for the torpedo bombers against the bright magnesium parachute flares. Williamson led the attack in Swordfish L4A and crossed the harbor breakwater as he descended to below 100 feet. As the massive battleship Conte de Cavour loomed up in front of him, Williamson released his torpedo. Dead on target, it struck the Cavour behind B turret, but as the Swordfish peeled away to starboard, it was hit by anti-aircraft fire and plunged into the harbor. Miraculously, Williamson and Scarlett survived the impact and was subsequently taken prisoner. The next two aircraft, L4C and L4R, aimed for the Vittorio Veneto, but both their torpedoes missed and exploded harmlessly near the battleship Andrea Doria. By now, the anti-aircraft fire was intense as the second flight came in with L4K in the lead. Its pilot, Lieutenant Kemp, dropped his torpedo at a range of 1,000 yards and immediately put his Swordfish into a steep climb. Below him, his torpedo ran true and hit the battleship Littorio on her starboard bow. L4K was followed by L4M, the early arrival at Taranto, with Lieutenant Swain at the controls. Maneuvering around the barrage balloon wires and through the heavy flak, he dropped his torpedo at a range of 400 yards, striking the Littorio once more. The last torpedo-armed Swordfish of the first wave also attacked the Littorio, but without success. The survivors turned for home, having severely damaged two battleships. Meanwhile, the four bomb-armed Swordfish attacked the warships in the Mar Piccolo with little success because of defective bombs. But L4L, with Sub-Lieutenant Sara as pilot, managed to destroy a seaplane hangar nearby. The last Swordfish of the first wave departed Taranto at 23:35 hours, as the Italians continued to spray shells and bullets into the air. 2 hours earlier, the 9 Swordfish of the second wave, led by Lieutenant Commander Ginger Hale, took off from the HMS Illustrious. But 2 of the aircraft collided on the dark flight deck, and one of them was badly damaged. The other was quickly repaired and followed the other 7 about 20 minutes later. Then another Swordfish succumbed to a technical problem and was forced to return to the aircraft carrier. As the remaining Swordfish approached Taranto, they were met by a curtain of anti-aircraft fire. 2 flare droppers flew ahead to illuminate the targets in the Mar Grande. After dropping their flares, L5B and L4F bombed the oil storage tanks on the dockside. Hale led his 5 torpedo-armed Swordfish in from the northwest. The Littorio was hit twice more, once again in the bow and once on the starboard quarter, but the torpedo failed to explode. In the firestorm, E4H was hit and Lieutenants Bailey and Slaughter were killed. The fire was so great and the aircraft flying so low that the Italian warships were firing at each other. Then Lieutenant Lee in L5H came flying past the mouth of Mar Piccolo and straight towards the battleship Caio Duilio. His torpedoes slammed home amidships, and the battleship immediately began to sink. The next Swordfish, L5K, flown by Lieutenant Torrens Spence, was headed for the Vittorio Veneto, but luck was with the battleship as the torpedo went wide before exploding. The final Swordfish then attacked the Veneto, but it also escaped destruction. The shore defenses fired thousands of rounds of ammunition, most without success. By 0300 hours, the last Swordfish landed on the deck of HMS Illustrious. The planners of Operation Judgment had expected at least 50% casualties for the attacking aircraft, but in fact only 2 Swordfish were lost and 2 air crewmen killed. With 3 Italian battleships sunk, it was a great victory. The morning after the raid on Taranto, news of its success spread across the Mediterranean fleet. In his laconic manner, Cunningham raised the signal on his flagship, "Illustrious, maneuver well executed." In addition, HMS Warspite hoisted the pennants, "All ships repeat signal Admiral is now flying." It was the greatest honor that any ship in the Royal Navy could receive. Admiral Leicester's plan had worked to perfection. But after seeing the first post-raid reconnaissance photographs, he wanted the Swordfish to return to Taranto the next night and destroy the remaining battleships. The Swordfish crews felt that they had done enough. Fortunately for them, the weather turned foul and flying became impossible. The Italians were now left to survey the damage. The Littorio had sunk by the bow after suffering 3 torpedo strikes. Remarkably, they salvaged the remains, and it returned to service just 5 months later. The Caio Duilio had been beached by its crew as it was sinking, but within 6 months it was also repaired. The Cavour had settled on the bottom of the harbor and was not repaired before the war's end. In the Mar Piccolo, the harbor was awash with oil from the damaged cruiser Taranto and other ships. On the day after the raid, the surviving battleships Vittorio Veneto and Giulio Cesare made steam and set sail for Naples. The same day the British raided Taranto, the Italian Regia Aeronautica mounted a bombing raid on the Thames estuary town of Medway with a force of 12 bombers and 40 fighters. but the defending Hurricanes shot them out of the sky. As Prime Minister Winston Churchill stated in Parliament, the Italian Air Force might better have stayed at home defending Taranto. He went on to say, "The Royal Navy has struck a crippling blow at the Italian fleet. I felt it my duty to bring this glorious episode to the immediate notice of the House." Within days, the Japanese naval attaché from Berlin arrived at Taranto and began asking questions about harbor depths and the torpedo tracks of the attacking Swordfish aircraft. The information was immediately dispatched to Tokyo. Far across the seas, the Japanese Naval High Command studied the British raid with great interest. Among the many lessons they learned was how to modify their torpedoes to run in shallow water. A year later, from 6 of its mainline aircraft carriers, the Japanese Navy launched a major attack against the United States Pacific Fleet at anchor at Pearl Harbor. As predicted by Billy Mitchell, the attack went in early on a Sunday morning. Mitchell's timing was off by just 20 minutes. At Pearl Harbor, the cost in capital ships was even greater than in Taranto. The Japanese sank or disabled 7 out of 8 battleships. At Taranto, 21 Swordfish dropped 11 torpedoes and 52 bombs to disable 7 warships, whereas 252 Japanese attack aircraft dropped 169 torpedoes and 103 bombs to disable 14 warships. Despite flying the old-fashioned string bag, the British pilots were 6 times more effective than their Japanese counterparts in their all-metal monoplanes. But both raids were only possible because of the aircraft carrier, and both proved how vital these would be in the future. At Pearl Harbor, since American carriers were absent, the Japanese did not have the opportunity to destroy them. That would cost Japan dearly. The naval air power of the U.S. would strike back and help to bring Japan to defeat. The Swordfish remained in service throughout World War II, a remarkable feat for an aircraft from 1936. It was one of the greatest aircraft in the history of the Fleet Air Arm. The Taranto raid was the Fleet Air Arm's greatest battle honor, and one that changed the face of naval warfare.